All right, welcome to our Erev Shabbat, a Friday special class, Parashat Kedoshim, sins of the mind. Is there such a thing? Well, that's what we'll explore today. We have some nods going around. Does the Torah have certain expectations on a mental level for a person to be able to have certain discipline and be held responsible to have to think certain thoughts and to abstain and refrain from others? The answer is absolutely yes. How do we know this? Well, first we know that the very tenets of Jewish faith are mainly based upon our faith. In other words, what we have faith in, what we believe, what we think. Anuchi Hashem Elokecha, the first of the Aseret Deberot, is believing in the existence and the providence of God. We have obligations to believe that there is one God, right? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. We have to believe that He's primal, that He's all powerful, that He has no physical attributes. Now, some of those might not be independent mitzvot. There certainly are obligations. We have to believe in concepts. We have to believe in prophecy. We're expected to believe in reward and punishment, that there's a just God. We're expected to believe with all our heart and soul that there will be times of redemption coming up soon in our days, Mashiach, Hayat Temedim. So obviously, there are numerous mental obligations, and they extend to the don't do's, to the lo ta'asehs. In fact, there are a few important ones in our parasha. Parashat Kedoshim, right in the beginning, in Pasuk Yud Tet, going to Pasuk Dalet. So it's the fourth Pasuk of the parasha. Al tifnu el ha'elinim. Second part of that statement is not actively to actually craft avodah zarah. But the first part, al tifnu, don't turn towards other deities. That has multiple potential infractions, and one of them is not to ponder and to think about other gods, or has v'shalom, to wonder about other powers and deities. That in and of itself is a averah. It's a lo ta'aseh. You're transgressing. It's not punishable. It's not a capital crime, but you're transgressing on something very serious. You have a few pisukim. Well, really, the next pasuk begins a string of 3 pisukim that carries with them, an avirah called pigul. Now, this is not a direct sin against God, but it certainly is a mental avirah, potential mental avirah that has to do with the service of God, i.e., in the Bet HaMikdash, wherein a kohen, should he, well, if you learned Parashiot, Masechtot, Mishnah, and Gemara, Zevahim, and others, you know that Kohen, while he's involved in the different services of slaughtering the animal for a korban, and bringing it to the mizbeach, receiving the blood, sprinkling, should he have thoughts, wrongful thoughts, here is just in a very slight technical manner of not doing one of those activities or eating it at not the proper time, so that korban becomes pigul, and eating that korban carries with a serious punishment of karet. So there you have, it's more indirect. It's the service of God. But certainly vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there are expectations for a person to be able, first of all, to discipline himself in certain beliefs and faiths of God. By the way, this includes the character and the fostering the relationship of Ahavat Hashem, love of God is Mizvat Aseh, Yirat Hashem, fear and consciousness of God. So certainly we have these active responsibilities, and we also have these, we have accountability to refraining from certain thoughts. What about vis-a-vis fellow man? Are there these mental responsibilities? Are there these expectations of a Jew to have to discipline himself in what positively he must think, or negatively negatively, he must refrain from thinking. The answer, once again, is absolutely yes. How do we know this? Well, you can start with Aseh Deberot, right? Where one of the Averot is we have the laws, the series of laws, right? Right? Now we say it loosely, we translate that unless to be jealousy. There, really in that context, it's a capital crime, which would only, only be if you carried out according to halakha by actually trying to purchase, and not that capital crime, but it belongs with a heavier avirot. You tried to purchase and acquire that which you coveted. But even if you didn't, the very idea of coveting and desiring and wanting property of someone else's, jealousy, is a lo ta'aseh, a negative commandment. How about in our parasha? We have two of the more difficult to accomplish. You could almost say heavy averot, damaging iniquities in terms of mental activity, man versus vis-a-vis his fellow man. Where do we have these? If we look, going in order of Pesukim, in Pasuk Tetvav, we're still in Perek Yutet, chapter 19, verse 15, where it says, Lo tasu avil b'mishpat, talking about a legal setting and a justice system. Lo tisaf v'nedad, lo tehedad p'nei chado. We'll overlook those for a moment for this purposes, and we end the pasuk with besedek tishpot amitecha. What does that mean? With righteousness should you judge a fellow man. So besides the more obvious directive in that pasuk, which is that the judge has to be very even-handed, non-biased, not influenced, he has to treat the plaintiff and defendant, both the litigants, equally. Besides that, says the Sefer HaChinuch and other of our great commentators that the tail end were included in this misvat aseh. It's a positive commandment expectation from us, is something called, and we're just discussing this in the first perek of Pirkei Avot that we are studying during this time of the year. Havedan kol ha'adam lekavdechu. Besedek, with righteousness, tishpot, you shall judge amitecha, your fellow man, giving the benefit of the doubt versus the lack thereof. This is an expectation. It's a positive commandment that a person's held accountable for his thought process in terms of how he judges and looks upon someone else and what act someone just did, and not assume that he just did something wrong. If there's any room for doubt whatsoever, one must lean towards the benefit of the doubt. This is a famous obligation. Here is the source of it, and it is purely mental. How do I assess the situation, the act that I just saw my fellow man commit? And of course, the mother of them all, and this is a lo ta'aseh, in terms of our mental obligation, man vis-a-vis his fellow man, there's a couple of pasukim later, and here it actually points out the heart or the mind. Pasuk Yud Zayin, Lo tisna et achicha bilbabecha. We focused our entire class on this pasuk last year in this parasha. If anyone remembers, do not hate, dislike your fellow man in your heart or in your mind. This we discussed is, although does not carry it with a physical bedin punishment, no physical consequences to this, at least in olam hazeh, because there's no act with it. It's a mental sin, but it is so serious in the potential harm and damage it can cause. Last year we went through talking about that is the prime reason that we're still here in this difficult exile after all these years. And in fact, regarding some of these mental avirot, we have very serious statements in the aforementioned Pirkei Avot. And there's a few similar ones regarding jealousy and hatred. Regarding jealousy, it says, among other things, that the qinaz mu'sinat ha'adam min ha'olam, removes a person from this world. It says also regarding a person that is has sinat habiriyot, has hatred for others, other people, specifically other Jews, Also, Mosi'in, it removes a person from this world. And what does that mean? It means that a person becomes both with the mental feelings and the sentiments of jealousy and of hatred, person becomes absolutely consumed with these emotions to the extent that he can't think straight, he can't see straight, he doesn't act rationally, and that really removes him from this world. He's out of himself. He's lost his own, the context of his own life. And he is so overwhelmed with feelings of hatred for someone or others or jealousy that he does not focus on his being, his existence, and what he has. And so we see that not only are there mental obligations regarding man and his fellow man, our fellow Jews, in terms of what we're positively supposed to think, and definitely what we have to refrain from thinking, but they are of the most severe avirot. So all this should be crystal clear just from studying Torah shebichtav, Pesukim, laws in Torah shebe'al peh. There's no question. But I think the bigger question is there such a thing as a sinful thought in terms of one just pondering, wondering, imagining, thinking about transgressions, thinking to sin? This is a whole world in and of itself in terms of topic matter. And the subject as to whether one plans to do an avirah, he plans to sin, and then pulls back and does not sin. That also, there are gemarot, there's discussion among Rishonim and Aharonim, and there are distinctions made, there's discussion. But by and large, the answer is that when one plans to sin and refrains, not only, by and large, is he not guilty or held guilty, but it is also very laudable, it's plausible, he's rewarded for such an activity, for holding back. However, is there a type of thought wherein the thought in its essence is a sinful type of thought? And where does that measure up? Not only in comparison to other types of thought, avera, mental, let's say, expectations for us to refrain from, but in comparison to actual physical avirot. And with that, we have what is some of the shocking statements you can say by Hachamim, but they stem from a famous pasuk that we recite on a daily basis at the end of our Kriyat Shema in Parashat Vayomer, and it's a warning by God. It's a three-pronged warning. Do not stray, do not follow. Three things the Torah says: lebabchem, your heart or your mind, anechem, your eyes, and then it says asher atem zonim, which you normally stray after, where you're veered towards, where you're drawn to. And the Gemara in Masechet Megillah discusses these and says, well, the outside two flanking are really godly sins. The first one, lebabchem, although there are other commentators on this, take the Gemara view of this. Don't follow lebabchem, your heart. That's minu, that's heresy, heretical thought. The latter one, which is zonim acharehem, it's thoughts of avodah zarah. We're already established that that's asur. But the middle one, achare lebabchem, achare einechem, I'm sorry, straying after your eyes. Says the Gemara Tzibaraita that is hirhure avera, thoughts of sin. We're not talking about do not hate, do not covet, do not be jealous. We're talking about don't. You must believe in God. Don't think of avodah zarah. Just pure hirhure avera, sinful thoughts. What's a sinful thought? And obviously, there are things that we don't have to be explicit about. There are inappropriate things to think about. They're ugly things to think about. To the type of acts or ideas that we're one to speak about, we would consider to be lowly inappropriate, ugly type of communication and verbalization, which you would quiet. You would quiet your son or your grandson. You would say, "Ay, haram. Why? How can you speak that way?" Thinking about those ideas and those acts and that activity, sinful thought. Without elaborating, we understand the type of thoughts we might be able. So, what does the Torah mean? Don't stray after them, and if you do, it's an avirah. And that's followed by what I mentioned. It's such a surprising statement, but it's a well-known one, and that is Masechet Yomah. And this takes this conversation to a whole nother level regarding the responsibilities of the mind. And here it is. Masechet Yomah says, Daf Kaftet 29a. Hirhure avera kashu me'avera. Thoughts of sin are more difficult, are more severe than the sin themselves. And everyone jumps out of their seats and says, how can that be? I didn't commit. I didn't physically engage in the ugly act of sin. I just thought about it. I didn't do it. And the Gemara pronounces boldly that is more severe. And how could that be? And there's a lot of discussion. But none more important than the well-known and profound statement by the Rambam in Moreh Nebuchim. And from it stems other streams of thought as well. The Rambam explains as follows. The Rambam says that a person can rebel against God in two ways. There's two possibilities and forms in which rebellion can take against God. Every sin is rebelliousness against God. Your creator, it's your maker, right? He has expectations. We're held accountable. And there are acts of rebellion. In fact, Na'ana, we say, Maradnu, we have rebelled against you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says, there's a physical and there's a mental. There's a person who sins in his homed, with his physicality, with his material being. He is sinning with, he calls it bibhemayuto. Now, how do you actually translate it into English? In the behemah, in the animalistic essence of man. In other words, non-human beings, non-homo sapiens, animals have an instinct as well to do what we would look at as an ugly act or sinful act, or to procreate and be with the opposite sex and to indulge in, unlimited eating. And, those are acts that we share in common, or desires that we have in common with others, species of the animal kingdom. When we sin with our bodies, obviously it's ugly, and we certainly transgress, but we sin with the animalistic aspect of our being. However, says the Rambam, a sin of the thought is a person's essence. And when a person rebels against God with his thought, it is with the precious part of the person's being. That aspect of the person is way more treasured and important and special, and what distinguishes him from other species and other beings. Our intellect is what makes us. Hashem infused in us a ruach hayim when he created us. The Targum says ruach melala, the ability to verbalize and to intellectualize and to think. And that's our precious organ. And with that, you sinned against God. That's a severe rebellion. So there's a difference between someone enslaving someone who's already was a slave, or someone who's enslaving someone who's free. The body is already enslaved to our desires, but the mind shouldn't be. That's more severe, says the Rambam. And based on that, the Kadakemach Rabbeinu Bahya takes it a step further. And he says that our thoughts, our pure thoughts, is something that is innately attached to our soul, our very soul, because our thoughts are intangible. Our intellects, our knowledge base is intangible, can't be identified, just like our soul. And it's the part that is the bridge between our body and our soul, the physical and the metaphysical. And therefore, there's something about our thoughts that is actually has an existence, a soul-like, non-physical, spiritual existence with God. How precious is that? And he says, therefore, a person can reach the greatest heights or the lowest lows because of his thoughts. And therefore, a person who sins with Hidhurim, explains that Ibn Abahya and the Kada Kemar, is very lowly. And it's an impurification like none other. Look how severe. And ends many years later, centuries later, the Hidah, and picks up on that thought and says that the thought is in a makom elyon, is actually in an upper world and part and parcel of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. Right. Our intellect attaches itself to our soul, which conceptually attaches itself to the Kisei HaKavod, the throne of God himself. How rebellious, how much of an affront, how belligerent is that for a person to defile and to dirty and sully his intellect, his thought process. That's Hirurei Avera. And that's why these great commentaries are explaining Kashim Avera. They're even more severe than the actual physical sin. Because the rebelliousness is with our most precious organ. It's with the angelic part of man. And with this, we take the responsibilities of the mind, the mental accountability to another level altogether. Not only do we have do's and don't do's, misvat aseh and lo ta'aseh, obligations regarding positive or refrain vis-a-vis HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not only do we have certain refrain and expectations regarding vis-a-vis our fellow man, Ben Adam Haviro, as is displayed and demonstrated in our Parashat Kedoshim, but we have expectations of discipline, of having known how to draw lines, how to have self-control, and to actually capture and train our mind in a way that it doesn't cross the line. It doesn't go in to the inappropriate, to the ugly, and that which is what Hakamim frame as Hirurei Avera, sins of the mind and sinful thought. A Jew that can refrain from that not only doesn't enter into that distasteful world, but it elevates himself, elevates the purity of his intellect to a much closer level to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, avoiding sinful thought not only, but also pivoting and elevating himself to pure thought and actually embracing HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the essence of his being. Baruch Adonai L'olam, Amen v'Amen. Shabbat Shalom.
So